People click into a live stream expecting something really ordinary. Maybe just a rant, maybe another chaotic update. But Paul Ferguson, he's on camera, sitting in his family's home in Michigan, talking really casually to a small but attentive audience. The chat scrolls, viewers joke, some are barely listening. And then he says it. His 15-year-old brother, Timothy, is dead. At first, it didn't quite land. Paul's tone was flat, almost sounded a bit rehearsed. There's no panic or rush to explain things, just a blunt announcement delivered to people on the internet, some friends, and some complete strangers. He mentioned something odd about his mother, asks viewers to leave a comment in the chat, and that's pretty much it. No eulogy for his brother, no tears like you would kind of expect. He just says he needs to go to bed and might update them tomorrow, and then he ends the stream with toodles. As viewers begin to realize what they had just heard, the mood in the chat shifts. Confusion turns into disbelief, disbelief turns into alarm because something isn't quite right. Timothy Ferguson hasn't been seen in public for months, and now, according to his own brother, he's gone. What starts as a live stream confession quickly becomes the first crack in a case that will expose terrible abuse, calculated cruelty, and a family secret hidden in plain sight. Just a fair warning to you guys, this case is quite brutal, so there is mentioning of child abuse and explicit torture, so viewer discretion is advised. On July 6, 2022, police in Muskegon County receive a call from a woman named Shanda van der Ark, and she was on the phone very frantically explaining that her 15-year-old son, Timothy, was found dead in his bedroom. Very quickly, officers and EMTs all arrive at her house, and everyone is trying to help her, and the scene is just completely chaotic. But Shanda, she's just sitting on the front steps of her house, and she is sobbing, like hands in her face, wailing about her son passing away. Now, of course, standard procedure is police need to ask her some questions. They need to figure out what is going on here and why is a 15-year-old boy dead inside of your home? So Shanda explains to the officer that she woke up that morning, went to go and check on her son Timothy, and she found him in bed, shook him, but he wasn't responding, and then suddenly attempted CPR to try and get him to wake up. And when that didn't work, she called 911. Now, she further went on to explain that the night before, she suddenly realized that Timothy was looking very skinny, like scarily skinny, and that he was wearing these very baggy, oversized clothes. And she really emphasized to the officer throughout this whole conversation that she had no idea just how skinny he really was, and that she tried to make him eat, but he would refuse. And she just started going on and on about how Timothy was a bit of a chronic liar and that he was on a hunger strike and that she tried her best to feed him, but he would just constantly refuse it. Now, of course, police had to go inside and find Timothy's body. And when they saw him and what condition he was in, they noticed how tiny he was for his age. I mean, Shanda was saying that he was refusing to eat, so maybe that could be true, but they're immediately concerned because this does not look like a kid who decided to stop eating just a couple of days ago. This is someone who had been starved for a very, very long time. And they're about to find out what exactly happened in that house. Now, we're going to go back in time a little bit to further understand who Shanda van der Ark was. She was born in 15th September 1975, and she unfortunately had a pretty hard start to her life. She grew up with a lot of abuse and a really dysfunctional family. When Shanda was around 6 years old, her mother, Mildred, tried to murder her grandmother for a $2 million inheritance, which is just insane. She tried to order a hitman for $25,000, but the attempt actually failed, so she went to prison. Now, sources don't really confirm for how long she was away for and for what charges she was put away for. But because of this happening at a very young age, Shanda and her sister had to go into foster care. They had no one else to take care of them, no one else to look out for them. At this time, Shanda was around the age of 6 to 9 years old, and this is when the abuse started, and it was really bad. She would be beaten and she would be forced to take ice baths. She would have her diet restricted. She was starved. Just really brutal abuse that no child should ever go through. Now, eventually, her mom does come out of prison, so Shanda goes back to live with her mom. Now, this is actually not a situation that's any better, considering that her mom tried to murder her grandmother. You can tell that perhaps she's not the person who is very capable of taking care of a child because her mom starts dating a new guy. So Shanda now has a new stepdad. And unfortunately, it gets even worse. Her mom passes away. Now, at this point, the only person who is taking care of Shanda and her sister is their stepfather. And he is not exactly the nicest guy. He does get full custody of them, so he is their sole guardian. And it's completely awful because he then starts sexually abusing them. So at first, they were in this terrible situation in the foster care system, went back home with their mom, and now they're just facing more and more abuse. Now, sources are a little bit unconfirmed with the details in terms of what extent the sexual abuse was and if it was just towards Shanda or also her sister. But nonetheless, at a certain point when they grew up a little bit and they were around teenagers at this point, Paige got pregnant. And this angered Shanda. She was incredibly furious at the fact that her sister got pregnant before her and was going to go off and start a whole new family. Now, we have to keep in mind that Shanda is being abused, sexually abused. She has been physically abused. And the type of mental toll that takes on you, especially from a very young age, clearly growing up, she has a lot of mental difficulties. Usually, a normal person wouldn't get jealous over their sister getting pregnant, right? So that's just something that we have to keep in mind. So, out of this terrible anger that Shanda was feeling towards her sister, she then punched her in the stomach and caused a miscarriage. Now, her sister Paige does not like Shanda for very obvious reasons because of what had happened. She would describe Shanda as someone who is incredibly entitled, felt like she was owed things and that everything was her right. She also described her as someone who's very controlling over situations and over other people. And she said that she could be a possible sociopath. Now, those are pretty blunt words to use towards a sister, but considering the situation, it's almost understandable why Paige feels that way to begin with. Now, after all of this had happened, they did eventually cut ties, Shanda and her sister, and they do not speak to each other. They're no longer in communication. And overall, it just seems like Shanda is a very troubled person. From a young age until she grew up to be a teenager, she had a pretty tough life and faced tons of abuse. But this does not justify what is to come. Now, in Shanda's 20s, she ends up having four children. Yeah, like four children, pretty much one after the other. And two of her children are named Paul and Timothy Ferguson. And they are going to be the main subjects of today's case. Now, they also underwent a ton of abuse when they were very young at the hands of Shanda. She was quite neglectful. She didn't really take care of her children. She didn't show a lot of physical love or affection towards them. Like she didn't hug them or tell them, I love you, good night. Like none of the normal motherly things you would expect a mother to do. And it gets very concerning because it wasn't just her neglecting her children. She would oftentimes be sitting on the couch in her day to day, like not taking care of the kids, not caring about anything. And she would just spend her time writing these sexual fantasy books that she had, where she would essentially write out all of the sexual abuse that she once faced as a kid and put it all into her writing. And she would then show these stories to her own children. Yes, which is also a form of sexual abuse. So the abuse just keeps getting passed along and it's just terrible. Now, there was multiple child protective services reports that happened over the years, concerned family members, friends, neighbors. There was a lot of welfare concerns for these children. So when CPS heard of these concerns, they took them pretty seriously. In 2012, Shanda lost her parental rights to all four of her children. CPS took this case very seriously and decided you are not fit to be a mother. So all of her kids then went to live with their dad. Now, Eric, their dad, and Shanda were divorced for quite some time now, and he lived elsewhere. So all four children went to go and live with him, and he then started taking care of the kids. And at this point, because Shanda had no parental rights over them, she was only allowed to visit her children 3 hours one time a week. Now, Shonda seemed to actually be really devastated by this. Even though she wasn't taking care of her children, she was neglecting them and doing all of the worst things possible to them, she was sad. She felt heartbroken that she lost her parental rights. But why would she be devastated if she didn't even care about taking care of them in the first place? Now, her two sons, Paul and Timothy, they were living with their dad, Eric, and Paul Ferguson. At the time of this case, he was around 20 years old, and he also unfortunately underwent abuse at the hands of their father. It wasn't like their living situation with their dad was any better, unfortunately, and Paul did not like his younger brother, Timothy. They really didn't get along with each other. Paul essentially despised him. Now, Timothy Ferguson, he had speech and motor impairments. He had difficulty with learning. He was also really easily overstimulated. He didn't like a lot of loud sounds, and he was on the autism spectrum. Now, he clearly has special needs, and children who have special needs need special care and attention. They need to go to the doctor. They perhaps need to be on medication. Now, because Shonda was quite neglectful, she didn't do any of this for Timothy. She didn't bring him to the doctor. He had no regular meds. And Eric was essentially the same. No one was really looking out for him, not even Timothy's older brother, Paul. Nobody. Now, their life with their dad, it was very chaotic for a lot of reasons. So Eric did remarry to a woman named Trisha, and Trisha had her own two sons. So essentially, there's 8 people living in a house, which is a lot. We have Eric and his 4 kids, then we have Trisha and her 2 sons. So I can't imagine the chaos that was going on there. There wasn't enough rooms for everybody, so a lot of the children had to share their spaces. And this was very overwhelming for Timothy. He didn't like loud noises. He got overstimulated really easily. He didn't like being touched. He needed a lot of personal space. And it was just so unfortunate because he was not doing any of the things that he needed to, like going to the doctor and whatnot. So he had a very, very tough time there. Now, during this period, Timothy and the other kids were going to school, and the teachers noticed that Timothy was not being well taken care of. And this was because when he came into school, he would look quite filthy, like his clothes would be very dirty, like he had been wearing them for a couple of days and he hadn't showered in some time. And he would also smell quite bad. And it was nice of the teachers because they would actually wash his clothes for him at the school and let him shower there. And Timothy also had struggles with controlling his bladder. And at his age, he should be able to go to the toilet on his own. But clearly, he was really struggling with that. And overall, he was just really skinny. Like, it seemed like he wasn't eating a lot. Overall, he just did not look like he was in great condition. Now, of course, the teachers confronted the parents. They went to Eric and said, "Hey, like, what is going on? Your kid is not looking good at all." And they also noticed that Paul himself was also sharing similar physical attributes to Timothy, also looking a little bit run down and a little bit skinny. But every time they confronted the parents, they just made excuses or just try to justify the situation. And unfortunately, not much else happened from that. Like, kind of just ends there. Now, Timothy did have a difficult time at their dad's house, but Paul did as well. He would also be somewhat physically abused by his dad, and he faced a lot of physical punishments, such as doing wall sits for like extended periods of times. And this was inflicted onto him as a form of discipline for when he misbehaved. Now, with all of this in mind, right, you might be thinking, so wait, teachers confronted the parents and they made excuses and then nothing happened? Well, kind of, yeah. The teachers did report their concerns to CPS as well, but nothing happened. They didn't take any action whatsoever. Now, during this time, we're going back to Shonda. She met another man online named Adam, and they got married, and then she ended up having a son with him. So now Shonda has four kids with Eric, and another son with another man. And he is unnamed. His identity is protected, so we can only refer to him as G. Now, it raises some questions because how can you lose your parental rights to four children because you neglect them, and then you go off and have another kid with another man? Like, to me, that is just crazy. Now, Shonda in 2018 went to law school, and she went to law school in Michigan University. She also got a scholarship, so her tuition was 100% covered. And she was actually pretty intelligent and she was a pretty good student, but she wasn't very well liked. People at school didn't really like her, weren't very fond of her. Some people said that she was a bit of a bully. She would like pick on people, very arrogant, very full of herself. So, although Shonda was striving academically, she wasn't really making a lot of friends and she wasn't really socializing with people. Now, after Shonda obtained her law degree, she even passed the bar. She then went on to get a job as a law clerk. And if you're not sure what that is, it's essentially someone who recently graduates law school. Their job is to conduct legal research and analyze cases by supporting judges and lawyers. So that's kind of what she was doing for some time. And then it ended up being her full time job. Now, we're going to go forward in time to 2020. And at this point, it has been years since Shonda has seen her kids. And kind of out of the blue, Paul calls Shonda and he tells her, I'm getting kicked out of the house. Dad doesn't want me here anymore. Can I please come and live with you? And Shonda says, yeah, come live with me. So Paul moves from Oklahoma, where he was living, to Michigan to live with his mom. Now, Timothy did not move with Paul. He continued to stay at Eric's house. And after a year, then Timothy also moved out of his dad's house and then went to live with Shonda. I think the situation there just got quite overwhelming. And then their dad essentially just couldn't manage taking care of what, six children, which is a lot of kids, but come on. You can't take care of your own kids. Like, it's a bit ridiculous. Nonetheless, Shonda was pretty happy to take them in. She hadn't seen her kids in some time. And even though Shonda wasn't a very good mother, she liked having children. But we have to keep in mind that technically, Shonda is not legally allowed to have Timothy and Paul in her care because, again, her parental rights were provoked many years before. And Timothy is a minor at this point, whereas Paul is around 18 years old. So Paul is kind of okay in this situation, but it is quite illegal for Timothy to be living with Shonda. And because she technically wasn't allowed to have him in her care, she wasn't able to register him for schooling or for the doctors, which again is super important for Timothy and his well being because he also enjoyed going to school. But she was now not able to give any of that for him. So Timothy was seeing no doctors, wasn't leaving the house and going to school and seeing friends or seeing teachers, none of it. All Timothy would do is just stay at home all day. Now we're going to go back to July 6th, where Shonda calls the police and tells them, my 15-year-old son is dead in his room. She's sitting on the doorsteps, sobbing, while an officer is questioning her. Behind her, in the entranceway of their house, is another officer, and he's kind of looking inside, but kind of hovering around to listen to the questioning. And he notices that the house structure is a little odd, and I'll try my best to explain it so you guys have a visual. When you enter, you can go upstairs into what is like a second floor loft. So it's not exactly like there's one story, then the second story. It's almost like a loft house. So from his angle, he can see upstairs into the kitchen, but he can also see a little bit downstairs. And there seems to be a sort of small bedroom with a loft bed. So the officer asks, where does Timothy sleep? And Shonda says, oh, he sleeps in that loft bed over there, the one that was right behind the officer. You see the blanket and the pillow and stuff. I will note it's a bit interesting that she had to emphasize that there was a pillow and a blanket. Like, obviously, if your son sleeps there, most people sleep with a blanket and a pillow. That's not really something you have to point out. And it was also strange because she would be sobbing and wailing. And then when she was asked that question, she would perk up and be like, oh, you see the pillow and blanket stuff? And then she would go back to wailing, which was a little bit strange, and the officers did take note of this. Now, after she was questioned and she explained her side of the story to the officer, she then decides, oh, let me go upstairs and check on my other son, Paul, who had been sitting in the kitchen. So she heads upstairs with the two officers behind her. She goes over to Paul. He's just sitting on the couch. She looks kind of dazed, a little bit out of it. I mean, his younger brother was just found dead that morning. And she goes over to him and she says, did you notice that Timothy was covering up with, big clothing? And very immediately after, without giving him any time to respond, she says, no, you didn't notice. Never mind. I love you, dear, but you never notice. And it's interesting that she moved past this quite quickly. Wouldn't you want to hear what your son had to say? Why are you asking him a question and then answering for him and not giving him any time to respond? These were all subtle things that the officers picked up on that they thought were a little bit strange. Now, of course, standard procedure, the officer goes over to Paul and has to ask him some questions. And he's sympathetic. He understands the situation that he's in. He doesn't want to urge him or pressure him to answer questions with haste. So he says, just let me know, what was your communication like with your brother? Did you guys talk often? Were you guys close? Just trying to get a better understanding of what they were like as two brothers. But Shanda, from the other end of the room, would kind of be listening in. And when she heard that line of questioning, she would interject and say, oh, they don't really speak. Yeah, they don't really talk that much. Again, not giving Paul any opportunity to speak for himself. The officer asked, when was the last time you spoke with your brother Timothy? And again, as Paul is trying to answer, Shanda just cuts in. And then the police ask Paul if he knew about this hunger strike. Because again, Shanda was going on and on about the fact that Timothy was on a hunger strike, was refusing to eat. So the officer asked Paul, did you know about this? And again, Shanda butts in. No. I don't think I told you about it, so I don't think he knows. And Paul then went on to claim, yeah, I actually didn't know about this hunger strike. Now, Shanda's behavior is a little bit strange for someone who is a grieving mother. And again, everyone grieves differently. Everyone would respond to situations like this differently. You don't know how you're going to feel or how you're going to act unless you're in that position. But Shanda, she would just be dismissing her son's responses to the officer, which I find strange. Personally, I find that strange. Your parents would probably want you to have your own opportunity to say your piece, to get things off of your chest as well. But she didn't allow him. It seemed like Shanda, like her sister Paige said, was very controlling indeed, wanted to manage other people, wanted to make sure what other people were saying. And she was constantly watching Paul like a hawk the whole time. Now, at this point, Timothy's body had been recovered and had been taken out of the house prior to all of this. And when the officers first saw his body, his condition was very severe. We know that from Shanda, he went on a hunger strike. And when you look at him, you can tell that he had not been eating for a while. We don't know how long exactly, but it had probably weeks. He was essentially just skin and bones. No fat, no muscle. You can see his collarbone sticking out, everything. It's completely awful. And his body was freezing to the touch as well. So at first glance, the officers noticed that this does not seem like a natural death. There is something very weird and suspicious going on in this house. And as Shanda kept reiterating the fact that Timothy was on a hunger strike and that she had no idea what state he was in, is weird. How could you not know that your own son was doing this or looked like this? Now, when officers first came into the house, there were some things that really stood out to them that they thought were very strange. Some of those things include cameras. There were cameras all over the house. There seemed to be some sort of padlock, like safety child padlocks on the fridge, on the cabinets, in the kitchen. The house was also very messy. And look, not everyone always has to be clean and tidy in their house. It's your space. You can do what you want. But it was really messy. There were things just everywhere. And if you have children in the house and you're a mother, you would kind of want some order, some cleanliness to make sure your kids are also not getting sick or perhaps, touching things that they shouldn't be touching. So the officers wanted to search the house. And at first, Shanda said no. Sorry, but you can't. So officers then return a couple days later very quickly with a search warrant to search the house because now they legally can. And oh my gosh, they discover a whole range of items that are incredibly concerning. Officers make their way downstairs into what is essentially a basement, and they see this small closet. It doesn't look anything weird or out of the ordinary, it's just a closet, but they're searching the whole premise. So they go towards it and they open the door. And inside of this really small room, like you would not be able to stretch like your full length body there. Probably not. The only thing you could probably do in there is just like sit or stand or kneel. And they immediately noticed that there was no blanket, no pillow, just a blue tarp over the floor that was covered in urine, essentially. And there was also a little camera there pointed towards it, almost as if it was intentionally placed there so someone could watch, observe this space. Other things that they had noticed in the house was motion sensors. There would be motion sensors in that closet, around the bathroom, and it seemed like these motion sensors would trigger an alarm. So if you were to move past it, a horrible sound would play. But it's weird, why would someone need these things? Why do you need a motion sensor in your house? For what? What type of alarm? Is it to keep people out? Is it for safety? If so, why is that in a closet? Shouldn't that be outside in your front door or by your backyard, to protect your house from people coming in? Now, they slowly start to realize, after they're uncovering all of these things, that there is a clear sign of abuse here. And Timothy was the one who faced this abuse. It seemed that tiny closet that he was in was essentially the space that he slept in. That loft bed that Shanda pointed to and claimed, oh, there's blankets and pillows there, that's where he slept. That was a lie. Timothy slept in this tiny little closet, and he would be forced to essentially kneel. He was not allowed to sleep peacefully as he would like. There was a camera watching him at all times. There was motion sensors, so anytime he made a movement, a loud sound would play. If he would start to drift to sleep and get comfortable, Shanda would yell at him, punish him. This obviously is abuse, and this was intentionally done to him as a form of sleep deprivation. And when they keep searching the house, they notice that the surveillance cameras, it's pretty intense. It's not just in the closet and in the downstairs basement bathroom where Timothy would use that toilet, it was all over the house. There was essentially no privacy. There was nowhere you could go to have a moment to yourself. You're constantly being monitored by somebody. Slowly but surely, the officers are starting to learn more about Shanda, more about what was going on inside of this house. And it wasn't just the fact that Timothy was forced to sleep in this super tiny closet space. They start to find out that the abuse goes way, way further. Now, Timothy faced a lot of physical abuse. He would be forced to run up and down the stairs, forced to do wall sits for essentially hours at a time. And we have to keep in mind that Timothy was not eating. He was not being fed. And it wasn't intentional. He didn't choose not to eat. It wasn't because Timothy was going on a hunger strike and whatnot. No, it's because Shanda was starving him. She was not feeding him, not giving him any nutritious food as a child would need, especially at that age when you're growing. None of it. She would starve him and then force him to do all of these physical exercises up and down the stairs until he essentially would collapse. But Shanda didn't care. This is what Timothy deserved, apparently in her eyes. Now, in the bathroom downstairs in the basement, they had this really big tub. And Shanda would essentially make Timothy do ice baths in that tub. She even bought an ice maker specifically for this. And she would place Timothy in this bath for hours at a time. And of course, this could possibly lead to hypothermia and other really concerning severe conditions. And they would never let Timothy as well rest, or whenever he would get into a comfortable position in the bath, trying to tolerate this intense pain, she would instantly, no, you can't do that. You need to go back to sitting upright. So even though he's already in an ice bath, already suffering, he wasn't even allowed to sit comfortably or find a nice position for himself. And not only that, Timothy's bathroom breaks, they were timed. So he couldn't just go to the bathroom whenever he pleased or whenever your body just naturally needed to go. He would be timed. If he needed to pee, you had 60 seconds. If you needed anything more, it'd be 120 seconds. Now, of course, this would then lead to Timothy having a lot of bladder control issues. He's already a child that suffers with a lot of overstimulation and whatnot. So not being able to have the proper process and privacy and respect to go to the toilet, and you are being put through this mental torment of course, it would lead to him having a couple of accidents. He wouldn't be able to control his bladder. Now, it seems like that blue tarp that was placed in that closet for him was for this, to prevent him, I guess, peeing onto the ground. And so Shanda would put that tarp into his closet as a way to have a layer of protection from the floor. And not only that, because he couldn't control his bladder, he was forced to wear adult diapers. Now, he was around 14 to 15 years old at this point. So he's a teenager. He should not be wearing adult diapers. And these diapers, they weren't frequently changed either. It wasn't like he would wear them and then do his business in them and then he would get changed and cleaned. No, he would be forced to wear them for hours and hours at a time, just in complete discomfort, covered in his own urine, essentially. And he didn't have any privacy. This poor boy had no privacy. There was no shower curtain in the bathroom as well. So there was essentially no moment of peace for him. As Shanda was intentionally starving Timothy, essentially was only giving him little bits of bread and rice every now and then, Timothy would get hungry. He was starving. So he would sneak up upstairs sometimes to the kitchen and try to get bits of food. But because he did this, Shanda didn't like it. You shouldn't be going around the house doing whatever you want, trying to grab whatever food you wanted. So she put locks on the cabinet and the fridge. And whenever he were to do these things, whenever he were to misbehave according to Shanda, there were punishments, severe punishments that Timothy had to go through. Oftentimes he would be dragged into the bathroom. And in the bathroom, there were an assortment of items ready for him. Zip ties to hold his hands back. The cameras for Shanda to watch and monitor him, to see what were to happen. Sometimes Shanda wouldn't be home. She would be at work. She had a 9 to 5. She was working as a law clerk. So Paul would sometimes step in and help. He would then essentially get a piece of white bread and drench it in this hot sauce. Now, this hot sauce, it's named Elijah's Extreme Regret. And it's not just your typical like Tabasco sauce or a bit of a spicy like chili oil type hot sauce. No, it is incredibly spicy. Now, if you're aware of the Scoville scale, there is a whole range and level of different spices. We have a bell pepper, which is on the 0 on the scale. It's not spicy, right? Not at all. Then above that, you have a jalapeno, which is around 2K to 50K Scoville units. And you can see the scale goes up and up and up. And the higher you up, of course, the more intense the spices. Now, the two spiciest peppers in the world are the Carolina Reaper and the Trinidad Scorpion. And on the very top of the Scoville scale are those two specific peppers. And those two specific peppers are the ingredients in Elijah's Extreme Regret hot sauce. And this is around 2 million Scoville units, okay? This is the same as a pepper spray. A pepper spray is also 2 million Scoville units. So I've never been pepper sprayed. I'm gonna imagine it hurts a lot. So can you imagine that? Ingesting it, having it go down into your stomach, how painful that must be. And Timothy would be forced to eat this hot sauce on an empty stomach, and he would eat huge amounts of it, forced. Sometimes his bread, the only piece of food that he would be given, would be drenched in this hot sauce. Not like a little dip, fully drenched into it, like it'd be soaking wet. It wouldn't even be bread anymore. It'd just basically be mush with a bunch of hot sauce on it. And he would eat it because he had no other choice. If he didn't eat it, something worse would probably happen to him, and he had no choice. If it wasn't for this, then you would essentially get no food. And viewer discretion is advised for this part. It is a little bit vulgar, but there was one time where Shanda actually asked Paul to drop a bit of this hot sauce onto Timothy's private area. And this was the one and only time where Paul said, no, I'm not doing that. That's too far. So it didn't happen. But it's just completely disgusting. Now, because Timothy was starved for a long period of time, he wasn't given any food, no nutrition, barely drank any water. And even the little times where he was able to get some bread or rice, he was timed. So it wasn't even like he could enjoy his food and eat it with grace and privacy. No, he was timed. And if you didn't finish it, then too bad. You don't get to eat. He didn't get to choose when to eat, what to eat. And because he was subjected to such terrible starvation that one time he snuck upstairs to the kitchen and he saw a raw hamburger patty and he ate it. He went into the fridge, he saw it there and he ate it. Raw meat, by the way. And there was another time where he ate frozen chicken nuggets. frozen. Can you imagine eating frozen meat or frozen food of any kind? That is obviously A, very, very dangerous and bad for you, but B, it shows just how desperate he was. He was literally willing just to get anything into his body. And he couldn't even enjoy it. He would have to rush as quickly as he could so he wouldn't get caught and then further punished for just trying to get some food. At this point, around the time that Timothy passed away, and after what was essentially months and months of torture, Timothy weighed around 69 pounds, which is around 30 kilograms at 15 years old. He should be double that weight. Timothy endured this horrific torture and abuse for 6 months. And when Paul and Timothy first moved in with Shanda, she was living with her new husband, Adam, and their new son that they had together named G. So there was the five of them in this house. And up until that point, everything was relatively okay. Timothy was still neglected quite often, but things weren't that bad yet. Until in January, Adam suffered with a really bad stroke. And because of this, he had to then go and live with his family in Florida. After that had happened, Shanda basically had free space. She didn't have anyone there to kind of look over her and see what she was doing to her kids because Shanda was hesitant. She didn't like Timothy. She did want to punish him. But because Adam was around before his stroke, it held Shanda back. It was essentially the only thing that protected Timothy from this abuse. Now, all of this evidence, everything that was found at the house, all the signs are pointing to Shanda. This is extremely concerning. You're saying your son was on a hunger strike. You're saying you didn't know about this. But everything that they found in that house is saying otherwise. So now we don't know for certain because there's a lack of footage from Shanda's interrogation. So we're going to assume after she was arrested and essentially brought into custody, she didn't want to talk to police anymore. And she essentially called in for an attorney. Now, from the very beginning, Shanda was always minimizing what had happened or what she was doing. She was always trying to find ways to justify herself and framing Timothy as someone who was difficult, someone who was a problem child in need of discipline. Like she was constantly trying to justify herself. Now, as officers found all of these really concerning items and evidence in the house that Timothy was subjected to very severe abuse, all eyes were on Shanda and she was immediately arrested and brought in. Now, we don't know for certain because there is a lack of footage from Shanda's interrogation. So it's very likely that after her arrest, she stopped talking to police really early on and called for an attorney. However, there is footage of Paul's interrogation when he was then brought in after the fact. Now, this interrogation footage of Paul is quite long. It's over an hour, and there's a lot that happens. It seems like Paul in this interview, when he's being questioned by this officer, he's very forthcoming. He doesn't really seem to be emotional or distressed. He essentially answers every question with a straight face and tells the officer everything he needed to know. He seemed to be very honest. And he seemed to have framed himself as someone who was following his mother's rules. He wasn't trying to defend himself or say, oh, I was forced into it. I didn't want to do it. I was scared. None of that. Just, well, my mother told me to do it, so I did it. She told me to not give Timothy food, so I didn't give him food. She told me to drench this bread in hot sauce and give it to him, so I did it. He didn't seem distressed when he was talking about all of these horrible things that he did to Timothy. He was just very calm, very put together. No language that indicated any sort of grief. When Paul told the officer that he fed Timothy bits of bread and rice, it almost seemed like he said it in a way that he thought it was normal. Like, yeah, I fed him bread and rice. Sometimes I'd feed him ramen. Sometimes I'd feed him pizza. All of those things are not foods that have nutrition in them. They're all just carbs, essentially, not really anything that you can feed someone for a long period of time and go, well, at least I gave him food, so it's okay. And when he went on to describe the fact that he was told by Shanda, instructed by her to do all of these things, he mentioned the hot sauce. And he said that one time when he was giving it to Timothy, he got some of it in his eye because he had rubbed his eye after he forced Timothy to eat this bread drenched in hot sauce. And that when he got it in his eye, it was ouch. It hurt him. It was ow. Now, to me, I think that's a bit interesting because you're subjecting your brother to what is essentially one of the worst pain, and you're talking about how your eye hurts because you have a bit of hot sauce in it. Can you imagine what your brother must have been feeling then? Throughout this whole interview, he emphasizes his obedience to his mother with the way that he explains how he did things to Timothy without question, and which is follow everything Shanda said essentially. It seemed like he never challenged. He never fought back. He kind of just went with it. At the beginning of the interview, Paul would be kind of sat in the chair with his knees up to his chest. When I was watching this over, I found that a little interesting because I feel like that position kind of reflects someone who needs some comfort, needs some physical comfort. It's a really comfortable position to be in. You're quite closed in on yourself. And of course, he is being interrogated by a police officer. He is only 20 years old at this point. So he is an adult, but still relatively young. So he's probably feeling a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit scared. But not only his body language was interesting to me, it was also the fact that he looked quite skinny himself. Not as skinny as Timothy, but he also was quite slim. Now, when Paul talked to the investigators, he just didn't frame his actions as choices he made because he wanted Timothy harmed. He framed them as things that he did because Shonda told him to. But I think that Paul had a choice. At the end of the day, you could have tried to do something. You could have maybe snuck your brother some pieces of food every now and then. Maybe you could have, I don't know, reached out to someone, a neighbor, called 911, anybody. You could have spoken out at any point. But he didn't. He didn't help his brother. He went along with it, no questions asked, and never fought back. But to what degree was Paul involved? Was it him just being compliant because he felt like he had to? He was being coerced by his mother, manipulated by his mother, or was he a willing participant? Well, Paul hated Timothy. From the very beginning, when they moved in with their dad, Eric, many years prior to this, he already despised Timothy at that point. So, when they moved in with Shonda, and then Adam had a stroke, and now Shonda is abusing Timothy, it was kind of easy for Paul to ride that wave and abuse him alongside Shonda because he despised Timothy as well. It wasn't difficult for him to get on board with that. And in his day to day, Paul didn't really do too much either. He was home most of the time. He did work at Applebee's by washing dishes in the evening, and he would also post sometimes Minecraft videos and videos on TikTok as well. There is actually one video that he posted online where you can see him and Timothy in it together. They're both smiling with their arms over one another. And it's honestly just, it's really heartbreaking to see. And it was essentially one of the only videos that you see online of the two of them together. And it seemed like overall Paul just didn't have a social life. He was a bit of a loner, you can say. And because Paul only worked at Applebee's in the evening and Shonda had a full-time job working a 9 to 5, it was almost as if they took turns abusing Timothy. When Shonda was at her 9 to 5 during the day and wasn't home, Paul would abuse Timothy. When Paul had to go to work in the evenings, Shonda would be home and then she would abuse Timothy. And it's almost like clockwork. They both could participate in this abuse towards him. After the abuse, after Timothy had passed away, before Paul was brought in for questioning, he went live. He posted YouTube videos, he posted TikTok, so he was already kind of a creator in the online space. He didn't necessarily have a super large following, but he did have a small community of followers. So he went live and he told his chat that his brother had passed away. And he announces the death as a really tragic loss, but he doesn't really seem to be crying. He's not mourning his brother. Like, first of all, if that were me, I would never go on a live stream to announce a family member's death. Like, first of all, that feels very intrusive and personal. It's such a incredibly difficult thing to go to announce that to people. In my opinion, when people ever do that, it's because they just want to garner sympathy and attention. It's not because they care for their loved one. They just want people to go, "Oh, I'm so sorry for you." And that is what Paul wanted to do. He wanted a reaction from people. He wanted to make himself seem to be almost like the victim, someone who needed this sympathy, who needed this care. But while he was talking about all of this, he just didn't seem distressed. He didn't seem to care. He was petting his dog, saying, "Yeah, me and the dog are fine. We're going to be chilling. Like, I don't really want to talk too much about my mother, though." With all of this in mind, it seems pretty clear. Paul was willingly involved in the abuse towards Timothy. He didn't challenge his mom. He didn't seek help. He wanted to hurt Timothy. He hated his brother. And the fact that his mother would give him free rein, give him all of these items and tools to inflict this pain onto Timothy, Paul was all for it. Now, at this point, the case is pretty clear. Paul and Shanda were responsible for Timothy's death. So, Paul Ferguson was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree child abuse and torture and false imprisonment, and Shanda was charged with first-degree child abuse, felony murder, and torture and false imprisonment as well. And when this case was brought to trial, Shanda didn't know that her own son, the person who had worked alongside her for months in this shared torture and abuse towards Timothy, was going on the stand to testify against her. In November 2023 in Kent County, Michigan, this is when the trial began. Now, Paul's defense centered on the fact that he was coerced by his mother. He was forced, manipulated into this. He didn't want to do it. He was just following Shanda's rules, and he was submissive to her. He was an obedient person because he was afraid of her authority. Now, the defense was a little bit weak. There was just too much evidence against Paul. So when the prosecutors came to the stand, they showed all of these text messages that were between Paul and Shanda. There is just so many text messages. Text messages from Shanda telling Paul to do this, to do that to Timothy. Paul responding saying, oh, I just did this, I just did that, giving her updates about what's going on. You can clearly see in these messages that he is actively participating, not resisting, not, denying any of these things. He was very willing. And in these messages where punishments were explicitly discussed between the two of them, they were talked about very methodically, not with a lot of emotion. Just, oh yeah, he's acting like this, do this. Oh, is he trying to get into the cabinet again? Punish him, hot sauce, put him in the ice bath, leave him there for hours. There's just too much evidence with all of these text messages that Paul did enforce this abuse and enforced food deprivation on his own accord, not only when he was told. Sometimes Paul would take things into his own hands and do it whenever he deemed fit, whenever he felt like punishing Timothy, even if Shanda didn't tell him to. The prosecution emphasized that this wasn't Paul being in a state of panic or chaos. This was routine for them. This was a structured house. They had a system in place. Timothy misbehaves, punish him. If he, wants to eat some food, starve him, lock him in the closet, watch his every move. Now, during the trial, Paul's demeanor was flat. He was emotionally blunted. He didn't seem like he was all there, really processing what was actually being said. And he just rarely made eye contact with anybody. And when testimonies were made and evidence was brought up about the extent of Timothy's suffering, he barely reacted to it. There was just no emotion there whatsoever. When it was time for Shanda's defense team to take the stand, they made it seem like Timothy did all of these things to himself, that Timothy refused to eat, that he was a problem child. Shanda really emphasized that Timothy was a troublemaker. He was just too difficult to handle. Even supposedly his dad couldn't take him, which was why Timothy went to live with her, and that she tried her best to help him. But Timothy was starving himself and covering it up by wearing these baggy clothes. Even when they were confronted with the abuse that she subjected him to, they would try to change the narrative and frame it as something that was a discipline, a necessary thing, sort of to imply structure in the household for whenever he misbehaved. But you don't actively starve your children, lock them in a closet, and force them to take ice baths when they want to eat some food because they're starving. Now, during the trial, there was video evidence of what was Timothy's last moments and Shanda berating him. And it was on a micro SD card that officers were able to recover from the house when they did their search warrants. And this came from that specific camera that was in the closet that Timothy would sleep in. But this footage was just deemed way too disturbing to be shown in court. So a law enforcement officer had to watch it, and then he described the events of what unfolded. In this footage, it's essentially Shanda dragging Timothy into a closet and yelling at him, insulting him, calling him pathetic, making fun of the way that he was breathing. This was essentially Timothy's last moments. He had shallow breaths. And Shanda would just look at him with such disgust and say, "You're pathetic. Why are you breathing like that?" And would just try to cover his mouth to essentially stop him from breathing that way because she didn't like it. In this video footage, Timothy is severely malnourished and incredibly skinny, and he has just this really shallow breathing. This was very disturbing to hear in court. It really upset a lot of people in the courtroom. And when these things were described, it was hard for some people to hear. But there's also this photograph of Timothy's body that was shown to Shanda. And when Shanda saw this image, she vomited on the stand. She just threw up. And of course, when this happened, it was a bit of a shock to everybody. Like, oh, okay, let's take a pause here. She was escorted out. And the prosecutors later then argued that this wasn't her vomiting out of grief because she was so upset and there were so many emotions because of what was going on. She was shocked at the confrontation. Shanda surely had seen Timothy in that state. We have video footage of her with Timothy in essentially his last moments. She knew what he had looked like. Now that you're presented with this image of him in court, you have the audacity to throw up at it. Now, these photos were highly disturbing, and due to the extent of Timothy's starvation and the condition of his body, these were not let out to the public. There were also other digital evidence that was brought up in trial that was essentially used against Shanda and Paul. So we have all of the text messages between Shanda and Paul. Like, these are very clear as day. They implicate them both. They're both willingly talking about the abuse and like what's going on and informing each other and updating each other on Timothy's condition, like just really disgusting stuff. And they have all of the surveillance cameras from the house. Like, Shanda had all of these cameras in her house to monitor Timothy, and it backfires because now these were being used as evidence against her in this trial. At this point, with all of this evidence, the jury rejected Paul's coercion defense, and both defendants were convicted on all major counts. By the time the trial was concluded, there was a generally agreed upon timeline of what happened to Timothy in the 24 hours leading up to his death. The day before Timothy died, before July 6th, that day, Paul went to go and wake Timothy up, as he does essentially every morning. And when Paul went over, Timothy was unresponsive. He wasn't waking up. Was he breathing? I don't know. He couldn't really tell. Paul frantically, "Timothy, wake up, wake up." Okay, he's not waking up. He's not responding. What do I do? Let me text my mom. So she texts Shanda. I don't know what to do. Timothy is not being responsive. He's not waking up. So what does Shanda say? She tells him to put Timothy into an ice bath. Maybe that'll wake him up. That'll give him a bit of a shock. So that's what Paul did. He puts Timothy into the ice bath. But Timothy was still unresponsive. He wasn't waking up. So then Shanda tells Paul, well, use a pizza roll. Use it as bait. Make him smell the pizza roll. Wave it into his face. Try to wake him up, but don't allow Timothy to eat it. And Paul does this, and Timothy wakes up. He smells this pizza roll because he's probably starving. He hasn't eaten anything in so long, and he just wanted to eat, but Paul didn't let him. And instead, Shanda told Paul to put Timothy into the ice bath again. So he was in the ice bath. He didn't wake up. He was baited to wake up with a pizza roll, and then he put him back into the ice bath. And he left him in there for 9 hours. For 9 hours, he was left in that ice bath because Shanda came home, then brought Paul to work, and then came back and continued to leave him in that ice bath until around 11 p.m. Now, this is the next day on July 6th. And on this morning, Paul went to wake up Timothy again. And this time, Timothy wasn't breathing. He couldn't really tell, but yeah, it really looked like he wasn't breathing. Maybe he's unresponsive like he was yesterday. But when he touched his body, it was stiff. It was really cold. Because there is video footage of this specific moment that had not been released to the public, but there is audio recordings that were released to the public. And we know now exactly what Paul and Shanda said when they found Timothy's body. And it's essentially the only time where you hear an ounce of emotion from Shanda. You can hear in this audio recording when Paul finds Timothy not responsive, then Shanda comes in also frantically like, "Oh my God, Timothy, wake up." She's saying, "Come on, Timothy, wake up," with this concern in her voice, a sort of panic, almost like she cares. But it's probably not emotion from being upset at the fact that Timothy had died. She probably wanted him to die for quite some time. She was subjecting him to this terrible abuse. She was probably emotional because now you have a dead child in your house. there's obviously going to be some legal consequences. You're going to have to figure out what your next move is. What are you going to do now? This is when Shanda decided, we're not calling 911 straight away. You can hear in the audio recording, Paul's like, do we call 911? Shanda's like, no, 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 no. She says, we need to make Timothy look more presentable before the police arrive. Because of course, Timothy's body was just in the closet. He was wearing an adult diaper on a blue tarp, skin and bones, cold to the touch. They needed to make him look more presentable. So they drag his body next to that same loft bed where Shanda had originally claimed where Timothy had slept. They take off his adult diaper and they dress him in jeans and a hoodie. But because of his size, they're huge on him. They're super baggy. And after they do all of this, after they think it's presentable enough now, after 18 minutes since they found his body, that's when they call the police. Now, fast forwarding, less than 2 years later, Timothy was finally given some kind of justice. Even though their sentences were 1 month apart, both Shanda and Paul were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During this trial, the judge heavily emphasized that Timothy saved prolonged suffering at the hands of both of them. And the nature of their abuse was very intentional, very clear. They had no remorse for their actions whatsoever. Now, this trial was heavily publicized by the media. It was televised. A lot of people tuned in for what was a really shocking and disturbing case. And when they came to the conclusion that both Paul and Shanda were going to go to life in prison, it almost felt like there was some closure, some justice. Finally, after all of this abuse for such a long period of time, now there is some sense of justice. But not everyone was pleased with this. Some people were infuriated by the fact that how did CPS not step in earlier? How did it even get to this point? When children go through this type of abuse and they die from it, it happens because no one stepped in, no one helped. And there definitely was people along the way who noticed the little signs, who saw the little things. At first, people thought that Paul was maybe another victim of Shanda's, that he was under her control. But as the evidence came out and as they went through the procedures and the trial and the interrogation and everything, no, that was not the case. Paul wanted to hurt Timothy. And the sympathy towards him didn't last very long at all. There was just way too much evidence against him. And apparently, after they were both sentenced to prison and Paul was now living the rest of his days there, his mental state seemed to be rapidly deteriorating. He had become excessively paranoid and he would claim that he felt like he was being watched or being recorded by something. Now, obviously he wasn't, but he felt like he was. And it's almost a bit ironic because that's how Timothy felt every single day of his life until his last moment. Timothy Ferguson, he never got the chance to grow up, to be protected, to be loved by a family, to live the life that he should have. And the people and systems that were meant to watch out for him failed him. And they only stepped in once it was too late. So rest in peace, Timothy Ferguson. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video and for taking the time to learn about today's case. This was a really brutal one and this was very heavy. So make sure you guys are checking in with yourselves after you watch these videos. Take some time if you need. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. If you found this video informative, make sure to leave a like, a subscribe, and feel free to share any thoughts that you have in the comment section down below. I'd love to talk with you guys. I'll see you in the next one.